Please tell me your name and your position here at Rutgers University.
I am Clement Alexander Price, Professor of History at Rutgers Newark, and I'm also the inaugural director of the Rutgers Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience.
Great. I'm going to ask you some questions about the liberation of Conklin Hall, and I was wondering if you could include my questions in your responses, because in the final version of this,
Sure.
my voice will not be present.
Okay.
And just to start off, could you tell me a little bit about the Black Organization of Students and what were some of the forces on the ground that had students that are of very young ages risk so much? I mean, we're talking about a lot of folks being the first in their families to go to college, and why would they put all of that on the line for someone else?
The origins of the Black Organization of Students is interesting even now, when that organization is not what it used to be. When I joined the faculty here at Rutgers way back in 1969, the Black Organization of Students was an umbrella group for mainly black students from throughout the greater Newark metropolitan area, and other black students from across and around the diaspora. When it started in the late 1960s, it seems to me that it emerged out of two kind of interconnecting forces or realities. Number one, black students from Newark and from just beyond Newark who were really grappling with black identity at a time in which that was an issue kind of tied up with masculinity and femininity, and are you black enough? Are you a part of the problem? Are you a part of the solution? All these swirling ideas about what is the responsibility of a black student leads a number of black students into BOSS. The other origin that comes to mind is that in the late 1960s, the civil rights movement really had done most of its work. The major civil rights bills had been passed: the right to vote, the right to peacefully assemble and protest injustice, the right to place certain demands before the American Republic. But what had not been resolved by the late 1960s is, so what? What is going to deliver meaningful aspects of freedom and justice and equality and opportunity to blacks? So the Black Organization of Students is this little minuscule organization that sought to address identity issues and prevail upon the empire being Rutgers, to make sure that the objectives of the civil rights movement had a meaning at Rutgers University. Long-winded, I know.
No, that was beautiful. I was just thinking, from my interview with Marcia Brown, she mentioned that Rutgers University seemed to have been going through an identity crisis, which makes sense if you look at the general population of the neighborhoods and the communities surrounding Rutgers Newark. But the overwhelmingly white campus with almost no representation of black faculty or staff. I know Bessie was on the board of
Bessie Hill.
Bessie Hill was on the board of governors, but she seemed to be the only one,
Right.
based on my research. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit as to how that happened in the first place. What was going on with
Sneeze first.
bless you,
Thank you.
with admissions or recruiting? How could it be that a major state university was so overwhelmingly white, even after the 1967 summer of discontent?
How could a public research university be so racialized is the question. Well, we know that when something becomes public, it doesn't necessarily become accessible. Public parks throughout America were oftentimes not open to the general public. If the general public included black people, if it included brown people, if it included poor people. So the great the great struggle of the second half of the 20th century was to give a deeper meaning to the word public. And of course, that brings us to Rutgers. I'm convinced that by the mid-1960s, the fact that Newark had become a predominantly black city was known to blacks, but was not fully appreciated or acknowledged by whites, keeping in mind that many of the whites who were prevailing upon Rutgers for their higher educational aspirations were just then becoming white. A generation before, they were ethnic whites, Italians, Jews, Poles, people from that vast European potpourri of cultures and sects and sectarians. Their forebears came to places like Newark and Patterson and Jersey City, and it's only after World War II that they had ascended to a certain kind of level where they could, in many ways, take advantage of white privilege. Blacks were not quite there yet. So the liberation of Conklin Hall and the effort by the students at Boss to, again, demand that this public institution behave like a public institution is a part of this historic quest in America to give meaning to public institutions, as if the stature of what is public and what is not was at stake, and indeed that was the case. When I joined the faculty of Rutgers in Newark in 1969, I was an oddity. I was, to quote my grandmother, a fly in the buttermilk. There were no black members of the history department. The other major departments of the university here in Newark, they weren't lily white. They were just not representative of blacks. And it has taken a long time for Rutgers to acknowledge that being a public university, paid or supported in large part by the taxpayers of New Jersey, it really does have a higher responsibility to all the taxpayers, their race, their ethnicity, their social class notwithstanding.
Great. I'm just going to adjust the camera for one moment.
Okay.
That's perfect. That brings me to my next question. I was looking over the archives through the Conklin Hall project being housed on the 4th floor of the Dana Library. And I was wondering if you could speak about some of the demands and whether or not they have been met. I know EOF was created. I understand that there was more recruitment of black faculty and staff. One of the demands was for open admissions to those with a high school diploma. I don't believe that that's what's happening now. So I was wondering if you could speak about the demands that the university acknowledged, but also if we could take a moment to acknowledge the demands that were never met, that we still need to look into today.
When we concern ourselves with the demands of the Conklin Hall liberators, I think we should divide those demands into the spirit of the demands and the letter of the demands. With respect to the letter of demands, they called for a fairly straight access of Newark High School graduates. That has not been met. In fact, one of the oddities of the Conklin Hall takeover more than 40 years after the takeover is that this campus, though right in the heart of Newark, is embarrassingly underrepresented by Newark High School graduates. And that might have something to do with the nature of public education in Newark as much as the nature of Rutgers as a public research university. Another demand was for the university to open its doors to professors of color. I may have been the first beneficiary of that demand. Now, there was a guy, I forget his name, a black American male teaching in the Graduate School of Business who preceded me. But on this side of the street, University Avenue, no, there was no African American, or for that matter, Hispanic American on the faculty. I was the guinea pig. I was the chief beneficiary of that particular demand. And over the years, although the campus student body became more diverse and the campus administrative staff became more diverse, the faculty has remained remarkably bereft of identifiable faculty members of African American background or heritage. That is still a great challenge. The good news is that has finally caught the attention of the administration. For the first time in the long history of Rutgers as a state university, the president of the Board of Governors is an African American minister of great renown, Dr. Bill Howard. And Reverend Howard, among his many aspirations as the Board of Governors chair, has put Rutgers on notice to begin to practice what it preaches. So over the last, 2 years, this university on all 3 campuses has rolled out a very ambitious effort to diversify the faculty by in an imaginative way, recruiting scholars of color. And by that I mean black and brown and Pacific Islanders, people who are traditionally underrepresented in the faculty ranks. Going back to the demands, there was a demand by the students to establish a Black Studies program. And a program was established soon after the liberation of Conklin Hall. That program evolved into a department. I believe it's observing its 40th anniversary this year. I know that's the case on the New Brunswick campus, and it nearly is the case on the Newark campus. The programs have remained painfully small because, as it turns out, Africana studies, which seemed so revolutionary in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and when they seemed so controversial, they've now, Africana studies as a field of study has found its way into history, into philosophy, into political science, certainly into anthropology, into criminal justice. So a lot of the people who normally would find their way into an Africana Studies department are actually being hired by some of the more traditional fields, which has had the unfortunate consequence of maintaining the small size of Africana Studies. The other demand, which I think needs to be mentioned because it speaks to, I guess, the broad benevolence of black students. They wanted more Hispanics represented in the student body and on the faculty. I always wonder what became of the Black Puerto Rican Alliance. Well, like many alliances, it grew old and mellowed and then all but disappeared. But back in the late 1960s, when the black students liberated this building, they were thinking about their Puerto Rican brothers and sisters who they wanted represented on this campus, and that's a good thing. When we look at the spirit of the demands, Rutgers Newark, as everybody knows, is one of the most diverse campuses in the world. It now markets that as a virtue. I think the spirit of the Conklin Hall demands is kind of captured in that. This is no longer a school defined by a white-black paradigm. This is a school comprised of people from various ethnic heritages who seemingly all get along on this remarkably diverse campus. And as one who's been on the faculty 40 years, I find it remarkable that when I walk into my classes, the pluralism, the pluralistic quality of the campus now challenges me to teach and think beyond the traditional black-white paradigm.
It's beautiful. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. I've been reading Dr. King's, Reverend Martin Luther King's speech, where he, for the first time, publicly denounces the war in Vietnam in 1967. And to me, it seemed that two movements were united under one person for a moment in time, and that being the civil rights movement and also the anti-war movement. And I was wondering, because we know that a lot of the anti-war movement was by people of color in this country, even though a lot of times it's portrayed as white hippies who are college, draft dodgers. Actually, the war became a huge burden for people of color, particularly poor people in urban centers, because they were most likely to be drafted, and then also hurt at home through inflations in the ghettos with cuts to domestic spending. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on that for the time period of the late 60s and early 70s.
The late 1960s were wrought, maybe overwrought, with a multiplicity of issues which seemingly centered on the healthiness of American democracy, the misbehaving of America in Southeast Asia, the racial underpinnings of a war against almost a pre-modern society, the fact that a disproportionately large number of poor brown and black and white soldiers were asked to represent this country's military objectives. All of that came to almost haunt the period. And I think it's fair to say that the students who liberated Conklin Hall and the students who benefited from that liberation had on their individual and collective minds the unfairness of that war, and how that war sucked money away from, urban initiatives in places like Newark. There's a relatively new documentary film on the 67 disorders here in Newark, Revolution 67, and one of the subtexts of that movie is that the war cost America so much that some of the monies that probably could have been better spent here at home were, and we now know in retrospect, were being wasted on an unlivable war on the other side of the globe. So when I think back to that period, and certainly the scholarship would bear out my memory, I remember the late 1960s and indeed the early 1970s as a period in which there were all kinds of issues bearing down on me as a young college professor and on my even younger students. The war in Vietnam, the seemingly ending of the civil rights movement, the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, and the seemingly rudderless movement that he left after his assassination. The increasing discontent within Black America over issues of identity, the proper, quote-unquote, role for women. I mean, all of these things were swirling around the era and gave the era an excitement, for some a confusion for others. For some it was an era of unbelievable idealism, and for others it was an era of inspired aimlessness. For some it was an era of youthful excess. For others it was an era for youthful misappropriation of time and energy. Interestingly enough, some of the students that I taught who were caught up in the movement had difficulty staying on top of their studies. Many of them dropped out of Rutgers and joined the movement. Many of them came by my office. Dr. Price, I want to be fully engaged in the movement. I said, the movement will always be there. I mean, I always think of Joe Brown, who led the charge that became the liberation of Conklin Hall. Joe Brown quit college, went to New Orleans, became a full-time freedom fighter, got married, had this long relationship with the movement, which compromised his marriage. It didn't last, compromised his health. He comes back to Newark. He finally graduates. I'd never seen such a roar of approval from the faculty when Joe Brown finally finished Rutgers Newark. But it was bittersweet because by the time he finished his undergraduate degree and his law degree from the Rutgers Law School here, he was up in age. His youth had passed him by. And I sometimes wonder, as someone who's been lucky enough to live for more than a few years, was the movement too much? Did it put too much of a burden on very young shoulders? My students who were caught up in that period were so much taken with Malcolm and Martin and Amiri Baraka and the Black Panthers and the war against the war that they didn't have a chance to be innocent students at Rutgers Newark. They grew up, in retrospect, many of them grew up too fast.
Thank you so much. I just had one more question. I read the President's Father's book on the Black
Richard L.
student
McCormick.
activism. And what struck me, because I'm doing my dissertation on this, and I wanted to read pretty much everything that was available, it seems to be the only piece that really focuses on the Black activism on the Rutgers campuses. But as much as it had interesting information, it seemed, to me at least personally, as an extremely sanitized account of the event. And it did read as something written by an administrator. And I was wondering what of the story you feel still needs to be told. What of the story is perhaps glossed over or now dismissed or perhaps even forgotten? And I attended the commemoration events, and I know that there was a great discussion about the N-word being used at the time. And I was wondering, what is still there that you would like to see perhaps brought up in the next book, or maybe at the next commemoration of the event? What piece of this is still missing for discussion and dialogue that we could maybe use to heal or learn from?
The missing piece of the Conklin Hall Chronicle goes something like this. How did that event, which in retrospect was probably the most daring thing that many of those kids ever did in their lives, how did it affect their lives going forward? When we observe the 40th anniversary of the takeover, for the first time, some of the veterans of that event said in a public setting that they feared for their lives, that they feared that if the building were reclaimed, that they would have been dealt bodily harm. I mean, that's scary. We now know that fear does have a long-lasting effect on one's emotional state of mind, on one's identity. So I think the missing piece is how that drama played out in the lives of those kids. Another missing piece, it seems to me, is to what extent...
I'm sorry, Dr. Price, that was the mic.
Oh. Another missing piece in that drama is the extent to which the university went to delay the content of the demands. Now, when I was a junior member of the faculty, and by junior, untenured, vulnerable, very much alone, there was coded speech on this campus designed to keep the minority student population low, especially at the College of Nursing. And some departments here did not aggressively try to diversify through the 1970s and well into the 1980s. And I'm old enough now and tenured enough now to know that what institutions do, they protect what they perceive to be in their vested interests. And Rutgers Newark perceived its best interest to remain a predominantly white school as long as it could. What ultimately caught up with that foolish objective was not so much black students, but the ripple effect of American immigration reform laws, which opened up the American Republic to people coming from the Caribbean, coming from the Pacific Rim, coming from Asia. If Rutgers Newark wanted to keep those people out, this campus probably would not have made it and would never have become the most diverse campus in the United States. So in many ways, the black students over time did not see the content of their demands realized. They saw the spirit of their demands realized, but not for their brothers and sisters, but for others.
Thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up,
Sure.
just because you made me think of this as you spoke. I know that we say it's the most diverse campus, and I remember asking Marcia Brown this question. Beyond the brochure and beyond the commercial and beyond the pamphlet, what does that actually mean on the ground? And her response was, maybe it's not so much something that Rutgers Newark can personally take credit for, but perhaps it's the physical location of Newark being a large port, a major city of immigration, a major location being right next to New York City, where it's a port of entry into the U.S. itself. And along with that, I understand that you were hired, and one other person, I know it was in the commemoration booklet, I forget his name at the moment, at the time, but...
Bob Curvin?
Right, and recently we've had Amy Cox and a few other folks, but in between that time, it seems that there wasn't much recruitment outside of the law school for faculty and staff of color, and I was wondering if you could just speak to that. You know, what does it mean to start an Africana Studies department but not have too many full-time faculty there? I mean, you're in the history department, and what does it mean to have a Clem Price and maybe a handful of other folks like Sherry Ann Butterfield? But really, if we look at arts and sciences, the number is well under 15, whereas not people of color are so overrepresented in the humanities.
The acquired asset of Rutgers being the most diverse campus, major campus in the United States, for me means the end of the mythology of whiteness being the defining principle of the campus's culture and future. It also means that blackness cannot mean what it used to mean, because we are a campus in which blackness and whiteness in their traditional context have no meaning. We're diverse. We're a campus of clans and rituals and memories and historical narratives, all trying to take advantage of the higher educational opportunities here. The paucity of African American numbers doesn't bother me as much as it once did, because now we're recruiting white scholars who are engaged in the study of blackness and whiteness and race. So in a way I'm saying whites are no longer what they used to seem to be. And that gives me pause and gives me some degree of comfort. I have white scholars in my department who are every bit as competent and diligent and hardworking and insightful as I hope I am when it comes to studying black people.
Aurelian, thanks.